Okay. No, I think I'm good, Jason. It just went live.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right, let me check real quick. Yeah, it looks like you're on now.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Is this your laptop or your other?
Hey folks, go ahead and you can test your microphones. If you did want to sign in to your YouTube account, you can ask questions as we go through as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll go ahead and get started. So growing fresh, healthy herb plants. With that in mind, where to start, how to start. So how I'll kind of structure it is assuming you've already dibbled and dabbled a little bit. I will throw in there some things too, if it really is your first time, in the sense of I've wanted to, and about to go ahead and get started. So, growing fresh, healthy herb plants really does, like we said in the earlier class at 8 o'clock, there, kind of starting from scratch, really does have much to do with where you're growing them, and then after that, we'll cover how you're growing them. So what I mean by where you're growing them would be in full sun and well-drained soil. Now, well-drained soil can be the container. It can also be a raised bed. It can also be in the ground. Folks have got very creative with where and how to grow things. Old shoes, bathtubs, kind of a few more odd things as well. So quite a lot, in the sense of different containers that you can use. And with that in mind, the different sizes and the shapes and all really just depend on what you're growing. And don't worry, we'll kind of go through all that as we move through the class too. So full sun and well-drained soil is really your basic building blocks and components to growing fresh, healthy herbs. With that in mind, whether it be on the deck, maybe you're in a townhouse, maybe you've got quite a lot of land, maybe you've got some raised beds. So again, as we move through, we'll kind of talk about all the different areas. And sorry for the backdrop, folks. We usually do it out on the patio, and it's quite a lot nicer, and you can hear the birds as well. But we had to move plants around, and people, out there too, looking and shopping and so forth. So as far as the, again, full sun and well-drained soil, really what you're after is the most sun possible. And no one likes to be out, all day on a hot, sunny summer's day. The herb plants will tolerate it fine. That's really what they're built for. If you can give them a little bit of afternoon relief, 5, 6 o'clock, in the afternoon on a hot summer day, they will perk back up and look a little nicer. It's certainly not essential, though. Really, that herb plants, the perennials, the rosemary, the lavender, the sage, the thyme, those kind of things really love that baking hot sun. So if you have a place in your yard in the ground that struggles to grow weeds, that's very, very little water, that's really what your herb plants would prefer. And they'll do well unattended to for the most part. So with that in mind, what does unattended to mean? It's more so just don't baby them. Don't overwater them. The quickest way to kill them is to have them be too wet and stay in soil that's too wet. So as far as growing fresh, healthy plants, especially the herbs, and we'll talk a little bit about the vegetables, but really try to stick to herbs this morning. Really the biggest thing is kind of watering them and tending to them when they need it, and then being sure to keep them cut and keep them fresh and healthy for you. So let's go back to full sun for a minute. What does full sun mean, and how much sun do I actually need? So 4 to 6 hours is really the lowest amount of full sun that you should be thinking of, being that, again, the return on investment is up to you. So to give you an idea, we have an area in the garden out here that is full sun, but it's soft packed clay. So terrible drainage in a garden full of other plants, more so natives and big grasses and that kind of thing. So they do fine in something like that. They just don't thrive if they're going to survive, kind of thing. So bear in mind, full sun is where you want them to be, and then you also want them in good drainage. Now, we'll talk about containers and raised beds, and we'll get into those kind of things in just a little minute. But let's kind of talk about the overarching theme of the full sun and the well-drained soil. So full sun, back to those hour requirements, the 4 to 6 hours. If you've got 4 to 6 hours of sun, the best place to start, or kind of your benchmark, is your rosemary, thyme, oregano, and sage. Those 4 take the lowest light out of all of the herb plants. So if you've got very low light and you're mindful of, I don't want to invest a whole lot, I want to see if it works first, That's your place to start. Rosemary, thyme, oregano, and sage. Those 4 take the lowest light out of all of the herb plants. Now, outside of those, you can branch into anything else you want, being that those are the benchmark for your return on investment. You're spending money on the plants, so be sure you're getting money back out of them. And the quicker you can go from being in the red to in the black with these plants, the happier, obviously, you're going to be, and the healthier they're going to be because you're cutting on them and using them, and they'll be growing nice and vigorously for you. So back to the, again, the sunlight. In 4 to 6 hours of sun, rosemary, thyme, oregano, sage, those woody perennials, if you're happy with how they're growing, how much they're producing, and you're getting your return on investment, then you can go ahead and branch out into your parsley, into your basil, into really anything at that point. But they're going to give you a really good idea of how quickly things grow back, how vigorously they grow to begin with, and how healthy they end up staying. A plant that doesn't get as much sun and doesn't grow as vigorously because of that, that they don't get that much sun, they are going to be more prone for bugs. It's a finer line on overwatering and having it sit in water. So again, that's kind of your starting point. So let's move on from there. You have the 6 to 8 hours of sun. You have the 8 to 10 hours of sun. You have the 10 and more hours of sun. Fantastic. That's really what you want, and things will grow quite a bit quicker for you as well. Now, to give you an idea of kind of how to wrap your head around that, if it's still a little bit unclear, a cabbage seed goes from seed to cabbage head in about 60 to 75 days. Some of them go from a seed to a cabbage head in anywhere from that 55, 60 day range to that 70 to 75 day range. What that means is hours of sunlight. So the reason that there's a range of about 2 weeks is if it's in full sun all day long, it will be on the shorter end of that spectrum. If it's in less sun, it will stretch towards that longer end of the spectrum. If you only have that 4 to 6 to 7 hours of sun, you're really only going to grow cabbage leaves, and you're not going to really be able to grow a cabbage head. So with that in mind, think about the things that you'll use most often. On the herb plants, things like a rosemary are very popular, things like a parsley. You might consider a couple of parsleys for 2 reasons. You might use it quite a bit, and you don't ever want to be without it. If you need half a cup for a recipe, you want to go out and make sure there's half a cup there for you. The other thing would be your caterpillars, which usually turn into butterflies. Not everyone's favorite, maybe, but certainly if you want them around, good to be able to feed them as well. So with that in mind, the parsley planted in different areas, some over here, some over there, they usually find one. By the time they've found the other one's grown back for you. And that's another good reason. Even if you don't use a whole lot of parsley, but you still want some butterflies, that's a good reason to have a couple of parsleys. Basil, quite a few folks like basil, pretty popular, well-known one. It does need above 50 degrees. So be mindful that not just during the day, but during the night, and then a constant above 50 degrees is what's going to keep your basil healthy. Now, below 50, once it gets to 49.9 degrees, obviously it's not going to die on the spot. But once it gets cool, it tends to stunt its growth. And while it's stunted, it just sits there and is easy picking for bugs, especially if it's getting watered a little too much and not using that water. That will quicken the cycle of funguses and so forth. So be mindful on your basil. Kind of late April into Mother's Day kind of time frame is the time to be putting basil out. So back to the amounts of plants, because the amounts of plants are going to determine how many containers or how big your raised bed is or how big your area needs to be. So with that in mind, a few basils, a couple parsleys, 1 rosemary, 1 oregano, 1 thyme, because they're going to spread and get quite large. Maybe a lemon verbena, maybe a stevia, a lemongrass, and so forth. So with those kind of herb plants kind of stacking up and, I like all those, and maybe a Thai basil, maybe a lemon basil, and so forth, how much area and space do I need? Well, let's go back a step and kind of think about what flavors you actually like. If you like Italian food, oregano, rosemary, parsley, basil, they're 4 easy ones straight off the bat there. Maybe you like Mexican food, you've got cilantro. You've also got chives. There's quite a few other ones there. Parsley and basil are there in the mix as well. If you like maybe herbal tea, you've got lemon verbena, you've got your mints, you've got your cinnamon basil. Those kind of things make great teas. So kind of think about how to incorporate the herbs into your already existing palate and cooking styles and habits. And then with that in mind, that'll keep you kind of stricter to the ones that you actually are going to use. And hopefully that will help you kind of have it not be out of control where it's too much work. You're caring for a few, you're enjoying those, you're seeing the benefits and the return on investment. And then you can obviously branch out from there because you're happy with what you've got going on and you want to expand that. So as far as spacing and then how much. So tight to the herb plants, vegetables will be another discussion for another time. So let's stick to herb plants. Herb plants themselves are designed to be used. The containers, the raised beds, and so forth, they're all designed really as a production facility. And your plants are actually the things that obviously you're going to be using. You're going to be cutting on them, and they'll be regrowing. So with that in mind, you want to be mindful that they are designed to be used. That's really what you've bought them for. But their end, what they're designed to do, might differ a little bit. And what do I mean by that? Well, you think of cilantro. So cilantro is a cool weather annual. Loves late March all through April into about the middle of May. As it heats up, it peters out and goes to seed and flowers. So with that in mind, a cilantro plant, you might want a few. And then later on around that mid-May, which is a great time for your basil, you can take that cilantro out and go ahead and put your basil in. So be thinking of your space as a production facility, and hopefully not as just a one-time use. You should be able to use that spot at least twice through the season and most likely 3 times. So what do I mean by that? You can do some lettuce, you can do some cilantro in the early spring. You can go ahead and put your basil and summer vegetables in there, and then come back in the fall, put some more cilantro in there, put some more parsley in there, and kale and spinach, and get ready for the winter time. So even though we're talking about herbs and we're going to set it up for herbs, you can grow other things in those spaces during the different times of year. You're not necessarily growing the herbs out there. Okay, so how many and how much space do I need? So herbs, again, back to that kind of area where your top growth and your roots of your herbs will grow in tandem. So more roots, more top growth, more roots, more top growth, more roots and top growth, and so on. So once it's established, we sell you a 4-inch pot. You take that home, you plant it, you can see new growth on it. It's ready to be cut and to be used. And really get in the habit of doing that probably at least weekly on most everything. And again, that'll keep it fresh. And with that in mind, always cutting on the top growth, it doesn't have to grow more and more and more and more roots, which is especially helpful in a container, because then you don't have all of this root area because you have all of this top growth. You're just keeping the top growth cut and short and keeping it producing more and more. So with that in mind, in a container, this is a 8-inch container. 10-inch container. So a 10-inch container, usually you would put 3. If you're going to be extra prudent and be on top and diligent, you can go ahead and put 4. So it just helps you get a little more out of that space, because you're not having plants taking over each other and getting all tangled up, but you can go ahead and keep it cut, and that'll keep it nice and fresh. So James has a question. How does cilantro do, in parentheses, taste when it's dehydrated? So anytime you dry herb plants, and we'll get back to the thing in just a moment, we'll answer James's question. So anytime you dry plants, usually it intensifies the flavor. A really good one to think of is stevia, because stevia is not everyone's favorite as a dry powdered form, because it has that sweetness, but it also has that green kind of planty, almost bitter kind of flavor to it. And that's really more so just because it's dried. When it's actually fresh, it's a really, really nice flavor. Just all of that sweetness, it does have a little bit of green kind of flavor to it, but really not a whole lot. Once you've dehydrated cilantro, it's kind of difficult to handle. It kind of turns to more of a powder than actual staying on the leaf material. So usually on your leafy plants, so basil, cilantro, parsley, chives, dill, fennel, those high kind of water content, more of your leafy kind of herb, or you freeze those, you food process it, you freeze it into a paste, and you can use the flavor that way. Usually it's a little easier to handle, obviously pretty easy to store as well. Things like your rosemary or your sage or your oregano, those woody kind of stems, usually they're dried, they're hung up around, and they're dried. So hopefully that answers your question, James. Back to how many and what kind of size of the areas for the planting. So how many herbs, you kind of look at what you're going to end up using them for. You're going to use a little bit of rosemary, a little bit of oregano, a little bit of parsley, maybe a bit more, and quite a bit of basil. Well, that's going to give you your template for how many plants, which then gives you your answer for how much space. So if you think of a general square foot, you should be easily able to get 4 herbs in there, if not 5. And again, keeping them cut short. There are a few exceptions. Lemongrass is actually one of the bigger ones because it gets huge. Usually you want it to get huge because it's the base of the stem that you're actually looking for. And for that kind of thing to grow and take place, the plant really does have to get big. So be mindful that there's a few of them that will be an exception, but in general, in a container, so let's say you've got a deck rail that's 2 foot long by 6 inches deep. Well, essentially you've got a square foot. So you're looking at about 5. And if you zigzag them through, some at the front, some at the back, you've got a little bit more design element to it as well. And again, you've kind of got that square foot area where you're taking up. Kind of think about what's on top has to be what's underneath. So if what's on top is huge, then there's a lot of roots under there. If you can keep it from growing a lot of roots, it's just going to use that soil around it, and that's it, to keep producing and keep putting out more fresh foliage. And again, that's really what you bought it for. Back to the cilantro real quick on that one before we finish up and move on. That cilantro is a good example of an annual. An annual is you plant it each year and the cold kills it, is probably the easiest and most general way of thinking of an annual. Whereas an annual in its truest sense really just has a finite season. It's just that most are planted in spring and die out with the winter time. Well, cilantro is a pretty good exception. Dill is another one. They are cool weather annuals and they really don't like the summertime. So with that in mind, you plant it late March, sometime late March, early April. This year probably could have planted it early March. It doesn't obviously like the freeze, but you can cover it. You just don't want to be doing that every night because it's just a pain. So you usually wait till it's not consistently freezing every night and then go ahead and plant it out. It loves the 60, like high 50s, 60s, 70 degree days and the high 30s, kind of low 40s, all the way through those kind of temperature ranges is really what it likes. So that late March into early April is the best time to plant it usually. You'll have it kind of through the middle of May. Once it really starts to heat up at nighttime in the consistent 55s, that's kind of when it starts to check out. So that's a good thing to bear in mind, though, because the more often you keep it cut and the shorter you keep it, the more you keep it from its end. What do I mean by that? Well, you plant the coriander seed. That gives you cilantro leaves. The cilantro leaves put out a bloom. That bloom dries and gives you coriander seed back. So that's the kind of the cycle that it has to go through to ensure that it puts out seed. That's what it's designed to do. So it's designed to put out seed. You've bought it for the leaves. If you want to keep it for the leaves, you have to keep it cut and cut and cut and cut. And again, it doesn't get to that place where it's put out enough leaves, grown to that height, so it can focus now on the flower and then put the seed out in the flower. So be mindful to keep all of your herbs cut, whether it be a perennial, whether it be an annual. It really doesn't matter. They're all designed to be used. And it's going to be the best way to keep the flavor fresh and tasty for you. Because as it gets big and old, it's got a lot of work to do. And it can't do all that work well and effective. Where if it's a small plant, it's not got a lot more work to do. And it's always putting out fresh, tasty, tender foliage for you. And do be mindful too, while I think of it, always on a basil, on an oregano, on a thyme, at the ends where the tips are, that's really where the flavor is. So don't cheat yourself and use all the older leaves. They're really just the place for photosynthesis to occur. The tops, the tips, where all the tender foliage is, that's where it's at. You've bought it. You should get first dibs on the flavor, and that's really where all the flavor is at. So now moving on to where to grow. So raised beds, containers, elevated raised beds. Like I said in the beginning, containers have taken on all shapes and sizes. We're going to split them in two. Containers are separate to your raised beds and elevated raised beds, more so because containers are smaller. They're a closed system. You put in a potting mix with that, really not a soil or a dirt. You put in a potting mix that usually doesn't offer that much in the way of nutrients, and nor do you really want it to. Herbs don't need a whole lot. They really don't like being overfed, nor do vegetables, but the herb plants won't taste right. They'll taste kind of wishy-washy. So with that in mind, where in the, let's tackle containers, sorry. So where to put the container? Again, you go back to the full sun. Now, what about the good drainage? You want a potting mix. Potting mixes are usually light and fluffy, nice light fluffy bag. I get it out and show you, but I'm in the office and I'd make a mess and I'd get in trouble. So it's very light and fluffy to the feel. When you pick the bag up, it should be nice and light. And potting mixes are very different to potting soils. So potting soils are dirt, they're very heavy and they stay wet for long periods of time. You can watch the other videos. I get into why they're different one versus the other. I'm not going to take up the time in this one. So potting mixes are very light and fluffy. They're actually soilless. It's just a blend of stuff to fill your container, to give it something to put your plant in, to give your plant something to receive the water and the nutrients, and then obviously return that favor in growing you a nice healthy plant. So once your planter is filled with the potting mix, you go ahead and put your plant in. You'll water that in. Herb plants in a container do need to be fertilized. Again, they're a closed system. So being a closed system, it's not going to put out what you don't put in. We have the fish and seaweed blend that we've had for years now. And this smells just like it. Espoma has come out with a fish and seaweed, and they've put mint oil in it. So it doesn't smell like minty fish or minty seaweed. It actually doesn't smell very bad at all. It's quite nice. So this is especially handy if you're going to use it for indoor plants. Now, these fertilizers, the fish and seaweed, are always very low dose. They're very, very weak fertilizers. 10-10-10 is pretty easy, pretty standard. Most everyone knows that as a fertilizer. These fertilizers are a 2-3-1, so about a fifth of the strength. And again, if you think of that for the herb plants, that's all that they need. They shouldn't be overfed. So in a container, a tablespoon per gallon once a month is all that your herbs will need. While we're on the topic, parsley is a good one to keep in a container, because if there's a lot of yellowing and you're not overwatering it, that's a sign of a nutrient deficiency. You give it a shot of the fish and seaweed, it should green back up and you should be back off and running. Raised beds and in the ground. So herb plants, basil, parsley, oregano, chives, herb plants in the ground do not need fertilizer under normal circumstances. I say under normal circumstances because we've all got our little nuances of different areas and different things and what was planted years ago and what washes through that area and what the neighbors are doing and all that kind of thing. So in general, herb plants planted in the ground or in a container do not need to be fed. And again, you go back to your parsley. If you've got a parsley in there and it's growing healthy and happy, you don't have to worry about feeding. If it's not looking very happy, and when I say yellowing leaves, I don't mean just a few leaves. I mean predominantly yellow. Again, you'll go ahead and you can hit it with the fish and the seaweed blend there, and that should perk it back up. As far as pruning, so when to prune often. Prune as often as you can. And again, as you look at kind of the area that you're devoting and how much money you're investing, try to get back as quickly as you can the money that you've invested. It's just better off for you. You're happier with what you've got going on. And then with that in mind, think of like a rosemary, if you would. So a rosemary plant planted in the ground or a container, even if you're pruning on it once a week, it's still going to get pretty big pretty quick. It loves to grow. And with that in mind, everyone usually likes a little bit of rosemary here or there, but you're going to get a lot of rosemary off a pretty small plant pretty quickly. You start cutting those tips on the rosemary plant, even if it's only 5, 6, 7 inches tall, you're going to end up with a nice kind of handful of rosemary once a week, once every other week kind of thing. With that in mind, rosemary is probably a better one to put in the ground or devote to its own container that doesn't necessarily have to be decorative, because it's going to grow pretty big without you doing too much to it. Things like your basil, things like your parsley are probably more important to you and are going to offer that yield, that return on investment, give you that money back quicker because you're going to be using them a lot more. So again, one rosemary is probably all you need for just a general household, one oregano, one thyme, and that kind of thing. Where that deviates is the different varieties. So we have an English thyme, we have a French thyme, a hi-ho silver thyme, and a silver edge thyme. All of those four, just in case you think I'm not doing 4 and 5, those 4 different varieties of thyme all have the same flavor. It's just the leaf presentation. Silver edge and the hi-ho silver speak for themselves. The English thyme is the rounder leaf. The French thyme is a long, skinny leaf. We also have lemon thyme. That comes in just regular green, and it also comes in golden variegated, where it's green in the center with a yellow variegation on the outside. So again, you might need both of those thymes because the lemon thyme has that lemon kind of overtones to it, but you also need your general culinary thyme for your soups and stews in winter and that kind of thing. So that's where you might have multiple thymes. You might have multiple mints. We've got spearmint, we've got chocolate peppermint, we've got regular peppermint. But by and large, really just a few of each one, or one of each one, sorry, unless it's a different variety, is really all that you need for just general flavoring. Things like your dill, your cilantro, your parsley, your basil. Maybe if you use those a lot, you'll consider more of them. So with that in mind, that will dictate kind of the space. Raised beds and in-ground for herb plants. Let's say you're starting off from scratch and you've got an area of your yard that you want to convert to a garden. I know plants aren't cheap. But as far as the sweat equity and spending on sprays and digging up and all that kind of thing, we try to have you kind of more focus on starting small and just getting a few and seeing if you like those. And then especially on the amending and the treating of the soil and digging up an area and all that kind of thing, all of that is good, but I don't want to be the one to make you do that, because I don't want to be the one to blame if it doesn't work out. Really is more so kind of on my side. On your area of your yard that has that full sun that you're thinking of putting that garden, you surely need to get rid of the grass. You just can't have grass messing with your herb plants, because they're going to take the nutrients and choke out your herb plants. But as far as amending, we've got some mushroom compost. That would just be good to mix in the dirt and plant them and see how they go. Again, on the watering side, the full sun is excellent for you. Give it drainage if you can, kind of mound things up and build things up is the way to go. Because here in Virginia, we have clay. So there's really no use digging into clay because you're just creating a sink bowl for all the water. But getting started shouldn't be that big of an issue for you, especially in a raised bed or a container. But again, that's the more expensive way to go, because you've got to pay for the container, you've got to pay for the raised bed at the start. Now, I will say those generally yield better results quicker for you, because you get to determine the area or the space that it goes in a little easier. Usually they're more convenient. You can have them closer to the house. And then with that in mind, you're filling into those beds, you're filling into those containers. So you're putting a nicer soil blend in there and not competing kind of with what you've already got going on. So like I said, if you just want to get started and you're looking to do it as quickly and as cheaply as you can, in the ground is fine. It's just be mindful that the more you kind of get into that area and doing different things, the more work it's going to be, the more cost it's going to be. So that's why raised beds and containers are pretty much the most popular way to go. On a raised bed, before we finish up, so how to fill a raised bed. So we've talked about containers being a potting mix. What do I do in a raised bed? So a raised bed is a third compost, a third topsoil, and a third sand. And let me explain those real quick. So a topsoil is your fill. Your compost is not fertilizer. It's not chicken manure. It's not horse manure or cow manure. It's a soil amendment. Compost is a soil amendment. So if you're making it from your house, you're mixing it with your leaves and your paper, That's a compost because it's really just trace minerals and elements. It's not a whole bunch of food. It's more so just the building blocks that it needs along with the food. So don't confuse the two, because they're easily confused, because it's kind of the bag tells you it's going to do everything for you and change your life, and you'll always have the best plants and everything. So there's obviously quite a bit of work in that. So don't confuse fertilizer and soil amendments. Soil amendments, like your mushroom compost, your compost, those kind of things are for the health of your soil, to keep it aerated. You want worms, you want good beneficial bugs in your soil. You need to create an environment to house those. Whereas a fertilizer is just straight up food for your plant. So obviously you need the soil structure, obviously you need the plant, and you need the fertilizer. So all three, but one is not the same as the other. So back to that third blend, a third topsoil, a third compost. Those are usually pretty easy to find. A third sand, the only place I know of is Pete Rose that has the concrete sand. It's also called construction sand. You just want a big coarse grain. Now what that's going to give you is drainage, and herb plants love drainage, like love drainage. So the herb plants that sit in water will still grow usually, but just nowhere near as vigorously as one that drains. They love to dry out, they love to get watered, they love to dry back out, and they love to get watered. And that's really the cycle you want to stick to. You don't just want to be watering because it looks dry. You want to do your homework. You want to inspect it. You want to look at not just the surface of the dirt there. You want to dig down a few inches. You want to look at the weather, what's coming. Is it going to rain tomorrow or the next day? Is it really that dry where it needs to happen now, where I water, or can it be watered tomorrow? It's always best to hold off on watering. But when you water, make sure you water very thoroughly. Sometimes you have to hit it one time, come back, hit it again, come back, hit it again. You need to soak it a few times to really get that water down consistently from the top all the way down to the bottom, because that's how you want your root growth. If you're constantly just watering a little bit, all of your roots stay high and they don't really get established and find all those nutrients down further on. So make sure when you water real thoroughly, but then let it dry right back out. Sometimes that takes time. And that was a pun too, because we sell time, the herb time. So with that, the drying out, on a perennial plant can really take some time. And I did it again. The rosemary, lavender, oregano, sage, those kind of things, once you plant it and water it in, you really might not have to touch it until later into June and July and August kind of thing. Again, but be mindful, you really want it to dry out. You want it to show some distress on those perennials, because your perennials, you want them to root down and establish, because once they're a whole year in the ground, they're pretty drought tolerant. A raised bed's a little different because it's not so much in the ground all the way established, but not very far off either. It's really the container that you want to be mindful of. Even though it's a perennial and once it's a year in the ground, it's drought tolerant, a container really does constrict that area of roots. So you want to be mindful on those to keep an eye on the watering. Sometimes an easy way on a container that's nice and established is pick it up and see if it's heavy. You can pick it up and look at the root area underneath and see if it's dry down there. But again, kind of looking at the overall picture, not just paying attention to what's dry on top. So full sun, well-drained soil, constantly cutting on them, and making sure you're getting your return on investment. Those three are going to set you up for quite a lot of success. And then all the little tweaks and nuances will come over time as well. I'll give it another little bit. If you've got any other questions, please feel free. We are in early April, so we have a pretty good selection of the different herbs and starting to get in some summer vegetables, tomatoes and peppers and so forth. And we'll have even more kind of as the April rolls into May. And then we peak for kind of late April, May for all the different types of herb plants that we have. So we do carry quite a lot of unusual ones, feverfew, valerian, and so forth, but always got your basics all the way through the season. So thanks so much, folks, for tuning in. Hope to see you again soon, working on some new topics, and we'll put that schedule out soon. But really appreciate your time and hopefully answered some questions. Thank you so much and have a great day.